The first thing I noticed about the Marchetti dining room was the sound of the cutlery. Not the chandelier, which was obscene in its size, 12 arms of Murano glass dripping crystals over a table, long enough to seat 20. Not the smell of the white truffle rosato that had been placed in front of me, untouched for the last 11 minutes. Not the faces of the 12 guests, who were all in their various ways, pretending not to watch what was happening at the far end of the table. It was the cutlery, the precise rhythmic sound of silver against porcelain, people eating, continuing to eat, while my fiancé told a story about me that was not true. Baldassare had a gift for timing. He knew exactly when to drop a detail into a conversation. A pause in the wrong place, a word choice that seemed generous, but was not. The faint smile of a man who is certain he is the most important person in the room. He had been doing it for 18 months. I had spent 18 months learning the exact angle at which to hold my chin, so that my expression read as composure, rather than the thing it actually was. Valentina has always been a bit imaginative, he said, and the table laughed softly. The way you laugh at something that is not quite a joke, but requires acknowledgement. I set down my fork, not dramatically, not slowly, just set it down because if I held it any longer, I was going to do something with it that would become a family story, repeated at Christmas for the next 40 years. The Marchetti tables was not the right place to make a scene. I understood this the way I understood most things about my life at that point, intellectually and with a growing sense of suffocation. My father, Aldo Greco, sat 3 chairs to my left, with the expression of a man calculating something. He had been calculating constantly for the last 8 months, ever since the first of his business losses had become impossible to hide. Baldassare Ferri came from money that did not need to calculate. Old Milan money, the kind that had been accumulating quietly for 4 generations, and now expressed itself through table placements. At dinners like this one, I had been engaged to him for 14 months. I had said yes because my father's eyes had been wet when he asked me to consider it, and because as I was 20 years old, and had not yet learned that gratitude and love are not the same category of feeling. She once told the Fontana family that their son had stolen her notebook at a gallery opening. Baldassare paused, tilting his head with the practiced regret of a man delivering bad news. He had not, of course. She simply left it in the car. But once Valentina decides on a version of events, that is what happened. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Measured. I had been practicing measured for so long. It had become its own kind of trap. Amor. Baldassare smiled. The smile that meant I had made an error by speaking. We do not need to. I did not leave it in the car. I said you took it. You showed it to the Fontanas, because there were letters in it, and you wanted them to see what kind of girl you were engaged to. The table went very still. I could hear it. That specific quality of silence that happens when 20 people stop pretending simultaneously. The cutlery ceased. Somewhere near the window, a chair shifted almost imperceptibly. Baldassare's jaw tightened in a way that most people in that room had probably never seen, because most people in that room had never made him actually angry. Embarrassed occasionally, inconvenienced sometimes, but angry. That was a thing he saved for private. You're doing it again, he said softly. The softness was worse than the volume. Valentina, you're doing the thing you do when you feel. Step back or you'll regret it. The voice came from the far end of the table. Not loud, not theatrical. 4 words delivered in a register so low and so absolute that they cut through the room the way a knife cuts through something that did not realize it was soft. Every head turned. Mine turned last because some part of me did not want to look. Some part of me was still calculating, still managing, still trying to find the version of this moment that did not require anyone else's intervention. The man who had spoken was sitting 3 seats from the end, in the chair that had been empty when I arrived. He was dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that does not come from calm. It comes from restraint. He was looking at Baldassare, the way you look at something you have already decided what to do with. Baldassare's face did something I had never seen it do. It went pale. Not the pale of surprise or social discomfort. The pale of a man who has just understood something about the room he is in that he did not understand 30 seconds ago. I Baldassare started. That was the last time. The stranger reached for his wine glass with the unhurried ease of someone at a private dinner, which technically he was. Continue eating. And the table. 12 adult, 3 of whom were older than my father, 2 of whom had political appointments, continued eating. I stared at the man at the end of the table. He did not look at me. By the time the secondo was served, his chair was empty. I told myself afterward that I would not think about him. This was the kind of thing I told myself frequently, and with diminishing success. I had told myself I would not think about the way Baldassare's voice changed in private versus in public. I had told myself I would not count the number of times in a week he touched my wrist too firmly while smiling at someone else. I had told myself for the entirety of our engagement that the feeling I woke up with on most mornings was normal. A low-grade dread that sat behind my sternum, like something that had not been digested. I told myself it was nerves or ambition, or the perfectly normal anxiety of a 21-year-old woman who had grown up in a family where the word arrangement was used without irony. The stranger at the Marquetti table had 4 words, and a pair of steel-gray eyes that had looked at Baldassare. The way you look at a problem you have already solved. I thought about him for 2 weeks. Not romantically, or not entirely romantically. It was more the way you think about a crack in the ceiling of a room you have been sitting in for months. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you know the crack exists, you start wondering about the structure beneath it. My days had a shape. I was finishing my degree in art history at the university, a program my father had approved because it was prestigious enough to mention at dinners and practical enough to seem intentional. Though the truth was, I had chosen it because of a single course on Baroque iconography. It had changed the way I understood what it meant for an image to carry weight. I worked 3 mornings a week at a small gallery in the Brera district called Stanza. It specialized in contemporary work from artists who had not yet been discovered by the collectors, who would eventually ruin them. My supervisor there was a woman named Ginevra. She was 53 with reading glasses. She kept losing in her own hair, and the sharpest eye for emerging talent I had ever encountered. "You're distracted," Ginevra told me on the Thursday after the Marquetti dinner. "I'm cataloging," I replied. "You've written the same artist name 3 times on different cards. Unless Moretti has 3 pieces in the back room I don't know about. Something is wrong with your attention." I set down the pen. Outside the November light was doing what November light in Milan does. Committing fully to gray without apology, as if it had considered the alternatives and rejected them. The gallery windows were tall and uncurtained, which Ginevra insisted on because she believed that art needed weather in its peripheral vision. "There was someone at a dinner last week," I said, which was less than the truth, and more than I had said to anyone. Ginevra removed her glasses from her hair, looked at them and put them back. "Someone interesting or someone dangerous? I don't know yet." "Those are often the same category," she said. "Finish the Moretti cards." I finished the Moretti cards. I went home. I sat in my apartment, small and carefully arranged, in a building on the Via Solferino. I had chosen it specifically because Baldassare found the neighborhood insufficiently prestigious. I tried to work on my thesis chapter. Instead, I spent 40 minutes thinking about the angle of a stranger's jaw in candlelight. This was not like me. I was not a woman who lost 40 minutes to a jaw. I was a woman who had spent the last 3 years learning to exist within a very specific set of parameters. And I had developed in that time what Ginevra called the curator's instinct. The ability to look at something carefully, identify what it was, label it correctly, and place it in the appropriate context. I applied this instinct to most things in my life, including my own emotional responses. The man at the table was an anomaly I could not catalog. That was the problem. That was the only problem. That's what I told myself. The call from my father came on a Wednesday morning. While I was standing at the stove, making coffee, I was moving with the particular focus of a person who is using the ritual of a small task to delay, thinking about a larger one. "There is something I need to discuss with you in person," Aldo Greco said. His voice had the texture of old fabric held up to the light, still presentable but showing the strain of repeated use. I drove to my parents' apartment in the Navigli that afternoon. It was a 20-minute drive that I extended by 15 minutes by taking the longer route through Sempione Park. The trees were bare now, and the light came through the branches at an angle that made everything look like a painting someone had not finished. My mother, Francesca, was not home. This was either coincidence or orchestration, and I suspected the latter. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea he had not touched, and a folder he had not opened. He looked smaller than he had at the Marchetti dinner. It was the thing about my father that I had been watching happen slowly for 2 years. This progressive diminishment, like watching a building settle. The structure was still there, but the foundations were shifting and everyone who loved the building was pretending not to notice. "I've sold the partnership interest in the Torino project," he said. I sat down. "To whom?" "A company called Meridian Holdings." "I don't know that name." "No." He picked up the tea and set it down. "You wouldn't." There was something in the way he said it that made me stop arranging my response and simply wait. My father was a man who chose words carefully. And when he chose them this carefully, it meant he was carrying something he needed help setting down. Meridian Holdings is managed by a man named Romano Caruso. He paused. He is acquiring several of my remaining assets as part of a restructuring arrangement. The terms are, another pause, more than fair. Exceptionally fair, which is itself something worth understanding. Why would he offer exceptionally fair terms? I asked. My father looked at his hands. Because, he said, Romano Caruso doesn't need my assets to make money. What he wanted was a different kind of arrangement. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, someone's delivery scooter passed on the street below, its engine briefly filling the silence and then retreating. "He wants to meet you," my father said. The word arrangement had always functioned in my family's vocabulary as a door, sometimes a door to a room you wanted to be in. More often a door to a room you were expected to enter, without asking too many questions about what was on the other side. I looked at my father's face. The guilt there was specific and layered. Not the guilt of a man who had made a terrible decision, but the guilt of a man who had made the only decision available, and understood exactly what it cost. "Tell me about Romano Caruso," I said. And so he did. The meeting was arranged for a Friday evening at a private dining room in a hotel near the Duomo, the kind of place where the walls were upholstered, and the silence was enforced not by rules, but by the unspoken understanding that everyone present had paid for discretion. I wore a dress I had bought 2 years ago for a gallery opening. Dark green silk cut simply with long sleeves and a neckline that was elegant rather than strategic. I wore it because it was the thing in my wardrobe that felt most like armor, that did not look like armor. My father accompanied me and then at the entrance to the private room said he would wait in the bar. I understood this was not his meeting to attend. The room had a single round table, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking Piazza del Duomo with the cathedral lit gold against the November dark. A man was standing at the window with his back to me. He was dark-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of stillness that does not come from calm. I stopped walking. I stood very still in the doorway of an upholstered room, in a hotel near the Duomo, and understood in the space of approximately 3 seconds every inexplicable thing about the last 2 weeks. The 40 minutes I had lost to a jaw and candlelight, the inability to catalog, the feeling of a crack in the ceiling that I could not stop looking at. Romano Caruso turned around. He had steel-gray eyes, an old scar through his left eyebrow, thin and barely visible, an expression that was cold by default, not cruel but sealed, and the specific quality of recognition in his face that told me he had known walking into this room exactly who he was about to see. He had always known. "Greco," he said. "You were at the Marchetti table," I said. "Yes, you knew who I was." A pause. Not uncomfortable. He didn't seem to experience discomfort the way other people did. "Yes, that dinner was 2 weeks ago." I didn't move from the doorway. The arrangement with my father was finalized before that dinner. Correct. The word landed with the weight of everything it contained. He had sat at a table where he knew my fiancé would humiliate me. He had intervened. He had left before I could speak to him, and then he had waited with the patience of a man who was accustomed to waiting for things to unfold. according to a sequence he had already calculated. For my father to deliver me to this room, you're going to have to explain that, I said. Romano Caruso looked at me for a moment with those sealed gray eyes. Then he gestured toward the table. Sit down, he said. We have several things to discuss. I walked into the room. I did not sit down immediately. I stood at the table for a moment, close enough to see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the precise maintenance of his beard, the watch on his wrist that was expensive in the way things are expensive when the person wearing them has never needed to display cost. I'm aware of what this arrangement implies, I said. I'm also aware that I was not consulted before it was structured. So before we discuss anything, I need to know one thing. He waited. Why did you intervene at the Marchetti dinner, if you already knew I would end up here? Romano Caruso was quiet for a moment. The cathedral was gold outside the window. Someone was playing something in the bar, low and indistinct. Because he said, what was happening was unacceptable. It was the most insufficient answer I had ever received. It was also, I realized with a clarity that unsettled me, the truest. I sat down. The terms of the arrangement were, as my father had said, exceptionally fair. Romano Caruso was acquiring 4 of my father's remaining business interests at valuations that my father's own lawyer, a man with 20 years of experience and a talent for understatement, described as generous to the point of being suspicious. In exchange, Aldo Greco would retain his apartment in the Navigli, a small property that had belonged to his grandmother, and what Romano referred to simply as the ability to sleep without worry. A phrase that landed in my chest with a strange weight, because it was the most precise description of what my father had lost over the last 2 years that I had ever heard anyone articulate. What Romano wanted in return was my time, specifically my presence at certain social events as his fiancé for a period of not less than 6 months. The word fiancé was used in the documentation. I had read the documentation. I had read it 3 times in the small study of my apartment, with a glass of water I kept forgetting to drink. There was a clause. The clause stated that the arrangement would be dissolved at either party's discretion, after the 6-month period or immediately in the event that the arrangement became, in the document's careful language, untenable for the parties involved. The clause had been drafted with a specificity that suggested someone had thought very carefully about the various ways this could go wrong and had attempted legally to account for them. What it did not account for, what no document could account for, was what happened during the second meeting. We met 3 times in the first week. The first meeting at the hotel near the Duomo had been formal and careful. 2 people constructing a perimeter around a situation neither had entirely chosen. The second meeting was at his office in a building near Porta Nuova, with a view of the city that on a clear day extended all the way to the Alps. The office itself was spare and deliberate, dark wood, clean surfaces, and a single large painting on the east wall that I recognized immediately as an early work by an artist named Catone, who had died before anyone outside of Sicily had heard of him. I stopped in front of the painting. You know it, Romano said. He was watching me from near the window. Catone, 1987, maybe 1988. He did a series of these. The same harbor, different times of day. Most of them are in private collections in Catania. I turned. You have the night one, that's rare. The night one was the one he painted last, Romano said. His daughter sold it to settle a debt. I bought it before it went to auction. Why that one specifically? He looked at the painting for a moment. Because it's the most honest. In the day versions, he was still deciding what he thought about the harbor. In the night version, he had stopped deciding. I looked at the painting again. The harbor in near darkness, the water barely distinguishable from the sky. A single lamp on the dock throwing yellow light onto black water. It was the most complete thing in an otherwise empty room. The arrangement has terms, I said, turning back to him. But it doesn't have a shape. What does this actually look like day to day? Romano moved to his desk unhurried and sat down with the ease of a man in a room he entirely controlled. 3 to 4 appearances per month at business or social events. Dinner with associates when required. Availability for travel if a situation demands it. He paused. Your daily life, your degree. The gallery continues as it is. The arrangement doesn't own your time. Only specific portions of it. And Baldassari. The name sat in the room differently than other words had. Ferry is no longer relevant to your life. Romano said it. Not with menace but the way you state a fact about geography. He won't see it that way. What Ferry sees is not something that concerns either of us. I looked at him across the spare deliberate office, in front of the one painting that told the truth about the room, and I understood that Romano Caruso was a man who spoke in declarative sentences because he had spent enough of his life making things true, that the gap between statement and reality had for him essentially closed. What I didn't understand yet was why that made me feel for the first time in 2 years like I could breathe all the way down. My best friend, Livia Mancini, was waiting at a cafe on the Via when I arrived 40 minutes after the meeting ended. She was 22, studying architecture, and possessed a particular talent for reading my face. A talent that had developed over the 9 years we had known each other, and that I had learned to both rely on and dread. "You look different," she said before I sat down. "I look exactly like the same." "You look like someone who has just made a decision." I ordered a coffee. I looked at the street for a moment, the November light doing its committed gray thing again. The last of the ginkgo leaves coming down in the small wind that came off the canals. "I think I'm engaged again," I said. Livia put down her cup. "To whom?" "Romano Caruso." The silence that followed had a very specific quality. The quality of someone rapidly reassessing information they thought they understood. Livia was quick and she was loyal. And she loved me in the way that old friends love each other. Not because you are consistently lovable, but because they have seen you at your worst and have decided clearly and without drama to stay. "Romano Caruso," she repeated, as in, "Yes, Valentina, I know. Do you?" I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup. Outside, a woman walked past with a very small dog wearing a coat. The mundanity of it was comforting in the particular way that mundane things are comforting when everything else has acquired significant weight. "He intervened at the Marchetti dinner," I said. "Before he ever spoke to my father, before I knew who he was." Livia was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "He said what was happening was unacceptable." Another pause. Livia, who had a talent for identifying exactly the right word for a situation, said, "Yes," I said. "And also, somehow the most straightforward thing anyone has said to me in 2 years." The first public appearance was at a charity concert at the Scala in December. I wore black, a structured dress with long sleeves, that Livia had helped me choose, which managed the precise balance between elegant and unapproachable that the situation seemed to require. Romano arrived at my apartment at 7, which was when he had said he would arrive, and stood in the doorway of my small entrance hall for a moment, with an expression that was, as always, sealed. I had learned in the 2 weeks between the hotel meeting and this evening that sealed and absent were not the same thing. Romano noticed everything. He simply responded to most of it privately, internally, in a register I couldn't access. It was like watching someone read a book in a language you knew but hadn't spoken since childhood. "You look," he started. I asked. A pause. Something moved through his eyes, brief, controlled, and then gone. Yes, the Scala was what it always was. A monument to the specific Milan conviction that beauty was a form of moral seriousness. The lobby was full of people I knew in various capacities. Gallery collectors, university acquaintances, several faces from dinners I had attended as Baldassari Ferry's fiancé. The transition between those two states had happened fast enough that the social record of it was still being processed. I could feel it in the way people looked at us. Not with surprise exactly, but with the specific alertness of people who have understood something has shifted and are rapidly recalibrating. Romano moved through the room with the unhurried ease of a man who had stopped finding rooms intimidating approximately 20 years ago. He was known here not warmly but weightily. People made space without being asked. Conversations reconfigured when he approached. It was not the deference paid to status. It was something more careful than that. A man approached us near the staircase. Late 40s. Silver-haired, with the expression of someone attempting to read a situation before committing to a register. He extended his hand to Romano, who shook it with the brevity of someone who had decided in advance how long this interaction would last. Caruso, I heard about the Greco acquisition. Bold move in this climate. Everything is a bold move in this climate, Romano said. Depends which direction you're moving. The silver-haired man laughed. The laugh of someone who isn't sure if they've just been complimented or dismissed. His eyes moved to me. And this is Valentina Greco, Romano said before I could answer. Not protectively, but precisely. As if setting a coordinate, I extended my hand. I know your work from the Fontana collection, I said. The Ricci pieces you acquired in 2019 are extraordinary. The silver-haired man blinked, recalibrated, and became, in the space of about 4 seconds, significantly more interested in the conversation. We spoke for 6 minutes about post-war Italian abstraction. By the time we moved toward the entrance to the hall, Romano had said almost nothing, and the silver-haired man had invited us to a dinner in January. When we were seated, Romano leaned slightly toward me and said very quietly, "You did that on purpose. The Ricci pieces are genuinely extraordinary," I said. And he needed to understand that I wasn't decorative. A pause, then low and even, he said. He understands it now. I looked at the stage where the orchestra was settling. In my peripheral vision, Romano was watching the stage too, or appearing to. But his attention, I was beginning to learn, was never entirely where it appeared to be. He was a man who processed the world through a wide angle, that he kept narrowed to appear specific. It was during the second movement of the Brahms that I became aware he was watching me. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone else in the hall would have noticed, but I had spent the last 3 weeks developing an acute sensitivity to the particular quality of attention the man paid to things he was actually interested in. The way his face closed down a fraction, the way his stillness deepened, I felt it now with the same precision I felt the music. I didn't turn, I let the Brahms move through me, and felt his attention like a second temperature in the air between us, and thought this is not going to be as simple as an arrangement. This was already not simple. But I had known that. I think I had known it in the doorway of the private dining room near the Duomo, when I had stood at the threshold for a moment before walking in, and understood that whatever I was walking toward was not the thing I had been told to expect. The curtain came down. Romano stood and offered his hand to help me rise. And when I took it, the contact lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a second more. But his thumb moved once, just once, across the back of my hand, so briefly it might not have happened. I looked at him. He was already looking toward the exit. I held that almost touch in my chest for the rest of the evening, like a note the orchestra had played once, and not repeated, and that I was not ready to be finished hearing. December moves in Milan, with the specific gray weight of a city that knows winter, and does not pretend otherwise. The canals reflected bare branches. The markets appeared in the piazzas with their warm-lit stalls and the smell of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine that made everything feel temporarily manageable. I moved through it the way I had learned to move through most things, with attention. With my hands in my pockets, with the curator's habit of looking at surfaces long enough to understand what was underneath them. Romano and I had settled into something that did not yet have a name. We appeared together at 2 dinners in December. A gallery opening in the Tortona district, where I spent 40 minutes in conversation with an artist, whose work I genuinely loved, while Romano stood slightly behind me, and to the left, talking to no one, and watching everything, and a private lunch with 3 of his associates that I understood only afterward had been a kind of evaluation. The associates were men of a particular type, older, careful, with the specific quality of stillness that comes from having spent decades in rooms where the wrong word had consequences. They had looked at me with the assessment of people accustomed to measuring things accurately. I had passed. Apparently, Romano told me this not with praise, but with the precise economy of a man reporting a fact. They respect you. They don't know me. They know enough. A pause. That's how it works in these rooms. You give people enough to respect and you keep the rest. I had thought about that for a long time. It was, I realized, exactly how Romano himself operated. He gave you enough. He kept the rest in a place that was entirely his. The question I was developing slowly, carefully, The way you develop something you're not ready to name. Was whether he kept the rest because he needed to or because he had simply never met anyone worth showing it to. Livia, when I told her this, said you are in significantly more trouble than you realize. I know, I said. Do you know how I know you know how? Because 2 months ago, you would have said I don't so and explained your reasoning for 4 minutes. You just said I know. I looked at my coffee. He moved a piece of art in his office. What piece? She asked. The Catone painting. It was on the east wall the first time I visited. Last week it was on the north wall where the light hits it differently in the afternoon. I paused. He moved it to the wall where it gets better light. He didn't mention it, he just moved it. Livia looked at me for a very long moment. Valentina, she said carefully. A man who moves a painting to give it better light and says nothing about it is either very thoughtful or very dangerous. I know, I said again. And you're sitting there smiling. I was very slightly. I hadn't noticed until she said it. I stopped, but the smile had already happened and Livia had already seen it. And some things once witnessed cannot be unwitnessed. It was 3 days later, a Tuesday early evening. The gallery closed, and Ginevra had gone home with her glasses lost in her hair again. Romano appeared at Stanza without warning. He stood in the doorway of the gallery the way he stood in most places. Like someone who has assessed the room before entering, and found nothing in it that required adjustment. I was in the back rewrapping a canvas for storage. I heard the bell above the door, looked up, and felt the specific quality of recognition that I was beginning to associate exclusively with him. A kind of internal recalibration, like a compass adjusting to true north. The gallery is closed, I said. I know. He moved through the front room slowly, looking at the work on the walls, not casually, with attention. Ginevra Sartori's space. You know Ginevra? I know of her. She has good instincts. He stopped in front of a large canvas near the window. A new piece by an artist I had been quietly excited about for 6 months, all deep blues and fractured geometry. This one is by Luca Ferrero. He is 26 years old. He has been working on this series for 3 years, and it is the best thing anyone his age has done in Milan recently. I stopped. Romano was looking at me. Not the painting. What is it? I asked. You talk about it differently, he said. The work you love, everyone does. No. He turned back to the painting. Most people perform enthusiasm. You just have it. There's no performance. A pause. It's noticeable. The gallery was very quiet. Outside, the December street was doing its things. A tram passing, footsteps. The distant sound of someone playing an accordion near the canal. Inside, the blue of the Ferrero painting held the room in a particular quality of light. Why are you here? I asked. Romano was quiet for a moment. I was in the neighborhood. You are not a man who is in neighborhoods by accident. A pause, then very slightly, so slightly that I might have imagined it, something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The structural precondition for a smile, present and immediately withdrawn. No, he said, I'm not. He stayed for 20 minutes. We talked about the Ferrero series, and about a collection he had visited in Zurich, and about a disputed attribution of a minor Caravaggio that had been in the news. He did not explain why he had come. When he left, he paused at the door. There's a dinner on Thursday, he said. Porta Venezia, 8 o'clock. I know, it's in the calendar. Yes, another pause. The Catone. I moved it because the afternoon light was better on the north wall. He said it the way you say something you've been holding for a while, and have finally decided to set down. Then he walked out into the December street. I stood in the blue light of the Ferrero painting for a long time afterward, holding that sentence like the note the orchestra had not repeated. He had noticed that I had noticed, and he had waited deliberately to tell me he knew. Some things once witnessed cannot be unwitnessed. I had stopped pretending this was simple approximately 3 weeks ago. The dinner on Thursday was at a townhouse in Porta Venezia, belonging to a man named Cosmo Arditi. He was in his 60s, silver-haired with the smooth manner of someone who had spent his entire adult life making dangerous things sound pleasant. He was the kind of host who controlled a room through warmth rather than weight, which made him in Romano's world more dangerous than the ones who used the alternative method. I understood more about Romano's world now, not the details. I had not asked for the details, and he had not offered them. There was an unspoken agreement between us that certain specific knowledge was not part of what we were building, but the shape of it. The way rooms reconfigured when he entered, the people who approached with deference, rather than warmth, the occasional phone call he took by stepping outside and returning with an expression unchanged, but his attention elsewhere for approximately 4 minutes before it settled back into the room. The shape of a man who held things together by force of will and reputation, in a world where those two things were not metaphorical. I had made my own assessment and arrived at I am not afraid of this. I am alert to it. Those are not the same thing. What I had not accounted for was Cosmo Arditi's wife. Her name was Renata. She was 55, dark-haired, with the sharp observational quality of a woman who had spent 30 years in a room full of men who underestimated her, and had learned to use that underestimation as a tool. She found me near the drinks table in the first 20 minutes and introduced herself with the specific efficiency of a woman who wanted information and had decided the direct route was fastest. "You're nothing like expected," she said. "What did you expect? Something more decorative." A pause. "Romano doesn't usually bring anyone to these things." "I'm aware." Renata looked at me with the focused assessment of someone recalibrating rapidly. "He's not an easy man. Most interesting people aren't." "That's generous." "It's accurate," I said. "Easy and interesting are generally in opposition. The question is whether the difficulty is worth what's underneath it." Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And is it?" I looked across the room to where Romano was standing with Cosmo and 2 other men, contained still, giving the conversation exactly as much as it required, and keeping the rest. He was aware I was looking. He didn't turn. "Ask me again in 6 months, I said. Renata made a sound that was half laugh, half something more serious. "I'll remember that." What happened 40 minutes later was not something I had anticipated. I was in the hallway outside the main salon, taking a moment alone in the specific way introverts at parties need to take moments alone. A door at the end of the hall opened and Baldassare Ferri walked out of it. He stopped when he saw me. I stopped when I saw him. The months since the Marchetti dinner had arranged themselves in my memory into something compressed and strange, as if his face belonged to a different timeline, one that had been folded over and placed under everything that had happened since. But he was here now in a hallway in Porta Venezia, with an expression that was cycling rapidly through surprise and anger, and the specific recalibration of a man who had arrived at a party believing it was safe, and has just discovered it isn't. "Valentina." "Baldassare." A pause. He looked at me the way he always had when I was in a room he hadn't expected me to control, with the specific contempt of a man who has confused dominance with intelligence. "I heard about your arrangement," he said. The word landed with the sneer he had always been able to apply to words he wanted to diminish. "Caruso, you've done well for yourself." "I've done exactly as well as I deserve," I said, which is something I couldn't have said 18 months ago. Something moved through his face. Not anger. Something colder than anger, the particular expression of a man who has realized he has lost something and is deciding whether to acknowledge the loss or punish the person who caused it. "You should be careful," he said softly. "The people Caruso associates with are not the kind who do." "Baldassare." Romano's voice came from the end of the hallway. He was standing at the entrance to the salon. He had the specific quality of stillness he carried when something had required his attention, and he had given it all of it. His eyes moved from Baldassare to me, and back to Baldassare, with an assessment that lasted approximately 2 seconds. "This hallway," Romano said, "is not a place for conversations that begin with warnings." Baldassare held Romano's gaze for exactly as long as it took to understand that holding Romano's gaze was a decision with consequences. Then he looked away. "Enjoy the evening," Baldassare said to me, not to Romano, which was its own kind of message. Then he walked back through the door he had come from. Romano crossed the hallway in several unhurried steps and stopped in front of me. He looked at my face for a moment. Not with the sealed quality of his default expression, but with something slightly more open, as if the last 30 seconds had moved something in him a fraction. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was, I realized, the first time he had asked me something that had nothing to do with logistics. Yes, I said. And then because it was true. Better than all right, actually. Romano looked at me for a moment longer. Then he offered his arm in the formal way. He offered things with precision and without commentary. I took it and we walked back into the salon together. I felt Cosmo Arditi's eyes on us from across the room and thought, whatever this is, it is no longer an arrangement. Whatever this was, I had stopped wanting it to end. January arrived with the specific clarity of a city that has decided to stop softening. The light went hard and clean, the canals reflecting a winter sky the color of unpolished silver. I finished my thesis chapter on Baroque iconography and handed it to my supervisor. She said it was unusually confident for someone who was still technically a student, which was the closest she came to enthusiastic. Romano read it. This was not something I had asked him to do. I had mentioned at dinner one evening that I had submitted a chapter, and 3 days later he had said he had. With the economy he applied to most things. The section on Caravaggio's use of shadow as moral indicator. The argument about selective illumination as ethical statement. It's the strongest part. I had stared at him. You read it? You mentioned it, he said. I mentioned submitting it, I replied. I didn't give it to you. A pause. Ginevra sent it. Another pause. I asked her to. There was an entire conversation in that exchange that we did not have. About what it meant that he had asked. That Ginevra had agreed without mentioning it to me. That he had read 50 pages of academic art history. Because I had said a sentence about it, at dinner. I filed it in the place where I was keeping all the things Romano did that he didn't explain and that I was not yet ready to name. What I could name was this. Livia's partner, Marco, worked in commercial real estate. And in early January he had dinner with a man named Sandro Vella, who worked in Romano's organization. A broad-shouldered, dark-humored Sicilian, who had the specific quality of being very funny. In a way that required paying close attention. Sandro and Livia had met at a dinner in December, and had spent 45 minutes arguing about architecture, in a way that both of them seemed to find enormously energizing. Livia told me about this on a Thursday over lunch, with the expression of someone reporting a suspicious finding. He knows things about load-bearing structures, she said. Is that relevant? It's suspicious. Why does a man who works for Romano Caruso know things about load-bearing structures? Perhaps because he finds buildings interesting. Livia pointed at me with her fork. Don't be reasonable about this. Sandro began appearing at dinners with the naturalness of someone who had been there all along, and simply not been noticed before. He and Livia argued about Milan's rationalist architecture at a dinner in January, and ended up at a bar on the Navigli until 2 in the morning discussing it. She texted me at midnight saying, "This is absurd," and I refused to explain it. I texted back, "I know the feeling." Romano noticed. He said nothing about it for 2 weeks. And then one evening sitting in the car after a dinner, he said, "Vella seems occupied. Livia is a compelling person." Evidently a pause. He was looking at the street, the winter city moving past the window. He's a good man. It was the most personal thing Romano had said about anyone in my presence. I understood it as what it was. A kind of reassurance offered sideways. In the Romano Caruso manner of offering things, precisely, without ceremony, and with the expectation that you were intelligent enough to understand what was being given. "I know," I said. He turned to look at me then briefly. And the winter streetlight moved across his face in a way that showed things his controlled expression usually kept private. A tiredness that was not physical. A something that I had been cataloging for weeks, without being able to label it correctly. I labeled it now quietly in the part of myself I kept for conclusions I wasn't ready to say aloud. Romano Caruso was a man who had been careful for so long, he had forgotten what it felt like not to be, and he was slowly, without admitting it to either of us, becoming less careful with me. I held that understanding like the painting in its better light. I did not say it. I let it be true in the space between us, and I waited, with a patience I had not known I possessed, for him to find his way to it himself. I had stopped being in a hurry. Some things are worth the exact amount of time they require. The call from Livia came on a Thursday evening in late January, and I knew from the first second, from the specific flatness of her voice, from the way she said my name with the extra syllable, that meant something had happened. that the quiet weeks were over. Baldassare has been talking, she said. I was sitting at my desk with a half-finished catalog entry on my screen. I saved the document. I stood up. The body knows before the mind does. Talking to whom? His family's lawyers, from what Sandro heard, and possibly to some of your father's former associates. Valentina, he's building something. It's not public yet, but it has the shape of something that's going to become public. What shape? A pause. He wants to damage the arrangement. Specifically, he wants to make your father's situation more precarious. If he can undermine the terms of the acquisition, or introduce doubt about the legitimacy of how the deal was structured, he can't. The documentation is clean. The documentation doesn't need to be clean to cause damage. It just needs to generate enough noise that Romano's associates get nervous. Livia's voice was measured and careful in the way it got when she was genuinely worried and was managing it. Sandro told me because he thought I should tell you. He said Romano knows some of it, but not all. I sat down on the edge of my bed. Outside, the January city was doing its hard light thing. The specific clarity of a winter that had decided to be honest. I thought about Baldassare in the hallway at Cosmo's dinner, with the expression of a man who had decided to punish the person who caused the loss. I had seen it. I had not underestimated it, but I had thought the calculation would run in a different direction. I had been wrong. I need to see Romano, I said. I know. Sandro thinks you should go to him directly, not through intermediaries. I called Romano. He answered on the second ring. I need to tell you something, I said, not on the phone. I'll be at the office in an hour, he said. Come when you're ready. I took a taxi. The city moved past the windows with its winter clarity. I sat with my hands in my lap and thought about a 21-year-old woman who had spent 18 months learning to exist within a very specific set of parameters and who was now in the back of a car in January, going to walk into a room and try to protect a man who had 4 words at a time been quietly dismantling every parameter she had built. Romano was at his desk when I arrived, his jacket off, sleeves rolled. With the quality of attention of someone who has set everything aside completely. He looked up when I walked in, and something in his face told me that whatever the hour, he was not unhappy I was here. I told him everything precisely organized the way I would have presented a catalog argument. Evidence in order, conclusion stated clearly at the end. Romano listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. You came here, he said, to give me information I could have received from 3 other sources. Yes. Why? I looked at him across the spare desk, with the winter city visible behind him. Because I wanted you to have it from me. Because I wanted to be here when you had it, not 3 steps removed. A pause. Because this is my situation too, not just yours. And I am not a person who manages things from a distance when I can be in the room. Romano looked at me for a long moment. The sealed quality of his expression had shifted. Not gone, but differently arranged, as if something underneath had moved, and the surface had not entirely settled back. He stood, he moved around the desk without hurry, and stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the tiredness in his face, and the thing beneath it, that I had been naming privately for weeks. He looked at me with the steel-gray eyes that had made Baldassare go pale across a dining room. But differently now, with something in them that was specific to me and had been accumulating since before either of us had spoken a word. You said, he began and stopped. Started again at the hotel the first night. You asked me why I intervened at the Marchetti dinner, if I already knew you would end up here. And you said because what was happening was unacceptable. That was true. He said it was also insufficient. The winter city held itself very still outside the window. The Cotton painting on its north wall, and its better light was behind me, and I didn't need to look at it. Tell me the rest, I said. Romano Caruso, who had been careful for longer than I had been alive, said, I saw you before the dinner in the lobby when you arrived. You were looking at the chandelier, not with admiration. You were cataloging it, figuring out what it was made of, how old it was, whether it was genuine or reproduction. You spent 45 seconds on a chandelier that everyone else walked under without looking up. He paused and I thought, whoever she is, she sees things the way they are. And then at the table, I understood who you were engaged to. And I watched what he did and I made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. His voice was absolutely level. Not because of any business arrangement, not because of what happened afterward, because what was happening to you and I don't have a word for it that isn't. He stopped. You were looking at the cutlery trying to hold it together and I was across the room and I could not sit there. The office was very quiet. You knew. I said that first night at the hotel. You already knew this wasn't going to be simple. Yes. And you structured it as an arrangement anyway. Because it was the only context in which you would have agreed to be in the same room as me after what you had just experienced. He was careful and honest. And because I needed time to be less dangerous to you. I looked at him for a long moment. The man who moved paintings to give them better light, who read 50 pages of academic art history without being asked, who had made himself available at 11 on a winter night because I had said, I need to tell you something. Romano, I said, yes, you are still somewhat dangerous to me. Something moved through his face. That brief controlled, almost not their thing that I now understood, was his version of completely undone. I know, he said. I'm sorry for it. I'm not asking you to apologize for it. Then what are you? I reached up and put my hand against his jaw, the jaw I had spent 40 minutes thinking about in candlelight 4 months ago, and felt his breath stop under my palm. I'm telling you, I said quietly, that we should stop pretending this is an arrangement. Romano Caruso put his hand over mine against his own jaw and held it there. Valentina, he said. Yes, it stopped being an arrangement. He paused long, choosing the words with the precision he brought to everything that mattered. The night at the Marchetti table, I looked at him, steel gray eyes, the old scar through his left brow, the tiredness that was not physical, the most carefully sealed man I had ever stood close to, holding my hand against his face in a room full of better light. I know, I said, and I kissed him. Not dramatically, but simply, the way you step into a room you have been standing outside of long enough to understand exactly what you're choosing, and he kissed me back with the controlled intensity of a man who has been holding something very still for a very long time and has finally been given permission to set it down. The winter city held steady outside the window. The Cotone painting held its harbor in the dark. I did not need to catalog this. I already knew exactly what it was. Baldassare moved in February. He filed a formal complaint with a regulatory body that oversaw commercial real estate acquisitions, alleging irregularities in the valuation of my father's assets. It was, as my father's lawyer observed, with controlled fury, technically sophisticated, and factually thin, the kind of challenge designed not to succeed legally, but to generate enough procedural noise to create uncertainty in the people around it. On the same day, a story appeared in a financial news outlet suggesting that Meridian Holdings had a pattern of predatory acquisition practices. 2 anonymous sources, no verifiable claims, the kind of journalism that functions as a message rather than a report. Romano read both in the morning and said nothing about them to me. I read both independently and said nothing about them to him. We had our own version of communication by then, a parallel processing that ran under the surface of our spoken exchanges, each of us tracking the situation from our respective angles and trusting the other to do so accurately. What Romano did was not loud. He called 3 people. I don't know who. I know that by the end of the week, 2 of Baldassare's business partners had quietly distanced themselves from the complaint, and the financial news story had been corrected. Not retracted, corrected by the outlet's own editorial team after what they described as a review of sourcing. What I did was not loud either. I called Renata Arditi. We met for coffee in the Quadrilatero, at a bar she had suggested, the kind of place where certain conversations happened with discretion. I told her precisely and without performance what Baldassare was doing and why. I told her about the notebook he had shown to the Fontana family. I told her about 18 months of a very specific kind of management. Renata asked 3 questions, then she said she would make some calls. Within 10 days, Baldassare's complaint had lost its most prominent supporting voice, a man named Giordani, whose withdrawal he cited as a reassessment of the available information. Romano found out about my conversation with Renata on a Wednesday evening. He stood in my apartment doorway. He had been coming to my apartment by then, with a frequency that had made the question of his separate address somewhere in the city increasingly theoretical. He looked at me with an expression that was not sealed at all. "You went to Renata," he said. "Yes, without telling me. You didn't tell me about the 3 calls you made." A pause. "No," he said, "I didn't. We handled it from our respective angles," I said. "That's what we do." Romano Caruso stood in my doorway in the February cold and looked at me. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You've never told me what you expected." "Something more manageable." I looked at him. "Would you prefer manageable?" The almost not there thing became something more. A fullness at the corner of his mouth, brief and genuine, that I had seen exactly twice before, and that I collected privately. The way you collect things that are rare, and that you understand the value of. Precisely because they don't appear often. "No," he said. "Good," I said. He came inside. The February city pressed against the windows. I made coffee, and we sat at my small kitchen table and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with arrangements or complications. We talked about the Cotton series, and whether the day paintings were cowardly or just unfinished, about a book Romano had read on his flight to Zurich, about my mother who had called that morning, and about Romano's mother who had died when he was 19. The first time he had mentioned her, which landed in the conversation with the specific weight of something held in private for a long time. I did not say anything about the weight of it. I simply received it the way you receive something rare, carefully without startling the moment. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Romano said, "Ferry isn't finished. I know he'll try again. Not legally. The legal avenue is closed, but men like Ferry have other avenues. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to be careful." "I am always careful. More careful than usual." His voice was level and specific. "He knows that you were part of what undid him. He will not forgive that." I looked at him across my small kitchen table, with the February city visible through the window behind him. "Romano, I have been managing Baldassare Ferry's opinion of me for 18 months. I am not afraid of him." "I know you're not afraid of him. That's exactly what worries me." I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He looked down at our hands. He turned his over and held mine. "I'm here," I said. "We're in this room. The rest can wait until morning." He looked at me. The tiredness and the not physical thing beneath it and the something else that was now, I understood, entirely mutual and entirely real. "Yes," he said. The February city held itself outside. We stayed in the kitchen until 2 o'clock in the morning. And the coffee got cold. I refilled it, and Romano Caruso, who had been careful for longer than I had been alive, sat at my small table in the warm light, and stopped for 2 hours being careful at all. It was the best thing I had ever witnessed. Baldassare came to the gallery on a Thursday in March, not to stanza to the street outside it. He was waiting when I left at closing time, standing at the corner with his hands in his coat pockets, and for a moment the March light was cold and direct. He looked like what he was, a man who had made a series of calculations and was now standing in the aftermath of having gotten them wrong. "I need to speak to you," he said. Ginevra was still inside. I had my phone in my pocket. I made a quick assessment, his posture, his expression, the specific quality of defeat that was in both, and decided that what was in front of me was not dangerous in the physical sense. It was something more complicated. 5 minutes, I said. We walked to the corner of the via in the cold March light, and I waited. "I'm withdrawing everything," he said. "The complaint, the everything, it's done." "I know," I said. "It's been done for 2 weeks. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger, not contempt, something flatter and more honest than either. "You changed," he said. "No, you just started seeing me accurately." A long pause. He looked at the street, at the ginkgo trees, still bare but barely in the March cold to show the first faint suggestion of green. "He's not what you think he is," Baldassare said. Not with menace. With something that might, if I were generous, have been genuine. "You don't know what I think," I said. "You never did." He looked at me for a moment longer. Then he nodded once with the specific briefness of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. He put his hands back in his coat pockets and walked away down the via. I stood at the corner and watched him go, and felt for the first time since a dining table in November entirely free of him. I called Romano. It's done, I said. A pause. I know. Were you watching? No. Another pause. I trusted you to handle it. I stood at the corner of the via in the March cold and felt something move through me, warm and specific and entirely without a name yet, which I had decided was fine. Not everything needed to be catalogued immediately. Some things were better understood slowly over time in the better light. I'll be home at 7, I said. I'll be there, he said. Home. He had started saying it without either of us noting when it had changed. His apartment near Porta Nuova remained technically his address. My apartment on the Via Solferino had become something different. A place that contained both of us, where the Cotoni painting had been joined by 2 other pieces, that Romano had moved there without comment, and that I had received without asking why. Because I already knew, because what was here was worth better light. The dinner at Cosmo and Renata Arditi's house in April was the first time Romano and I appeared together in a room full of people who knew what we were. Not an arrangement, not a structured engagement, not a calculated presence at social events, each other's. Renata had organized it, a dinner of 20 people, the winter's social circuit transformed by a spring that had arrived in Milan with the specific relief of a city that has been holding its breath. The garden doors were open, there were white peonies on the table. A string quartet was doing what string quartets do at Renata Arditi's dinner parties, making everything feel like a scene worth remembering. Romano stood with me at the entrance to the garden for a moment, before we went in. The April evening warm and the city behind us golden with the particular gold of a Milan spring that has finally decided to commit. He was wearing dark gray. He had the look he sometimes had in good light, the sealed quality slightly open, as if he had decided that this room on this evening was a room where he could afford to be less guarded. Renata has outdone herself, I said. Renata always outdoes herself. It's a policy. I looked at him, the old scar through his left eyebrow, the silver at his temples beginning now to spread, the gray eyes that were not right now sealed at all. Romano, yes. Livia is inside, and she's going to spend the entire evening interrogating you about load-bearing structures. And I need you to know I take no responsibility for this. The fullness at the corner of his mouth, genuine, unhidden, the rare thing I collected. Vela has already warned me, and Livia Mancini has very good instincts about structure. She's right about the rationalist buildings. Most people defend them out of sentimentality. She defends them on principle. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who moved paintings to give them better light, and read academic papers without being asked, and had said in a room full of cold winter light that he had been trying to be less dangerous to me. I love you, I said. I hadn't planned to say it there on the threshold of Renata's garden, with the April evening warm and 20 people waiting inside, but it was true in that moment, with the specific completeness of things that have been true for a long time, and have simply been waiting for the right moment to be said aloud. Romano looked at me. The gray eyes, the something that had been accumulating in them since a dining table in November. Since 45 seconds on a chandelier in a lobby, since 4 words delivered in a register so low and so absolute that they had changed the shape of a room. Valentina, he said. Yes, I have been in love with you, he said carefully, as if he were setting something very precious down in a very specific place, since the Marchetti dinner. And then, quietly, in a garden on a spring evening with white peonies, and the indifferent, beautiful city behind us, I knew walking into that lobby that you were going to be my ruin. I had already accepted it. I looked at him and saw the fullness at the corner of his mouth. Genuine, unhidden, given. Yes, he said, and I would accept it again. We went into the garden. Renata saw us from across the table, and made the particular expression of a woman who has been right about something for several months, and is allowing herself a private moment of satisfaction. Livia appeared at Romano's side within approximately 90 seconds, and said something about the load-bearing capacity of the Velasca Tower that made him actually argue back, which was the thing I'd been waiting to see since December. Sandro appeared at mine and said quietly, he hasn't argued about architecture with anyone in 11 years. You've done something irreversible. I know, I said. The string quartet played. The white peonies held the April light. My father across the table had the look of a man who had set down something heavy and was remembering what it felt like not to carry it. Romano, 3 seats down, was demonstrating to Livia why she was wrong about the Velasca, with the specific intensity of a man who had been waiting for someone to argue with him properly about something he cared about. I looked at all of it. I let it be what it was. I had stopped needing to catalog it. 2 years later, the Cotone painting hung in the living room of a house in the Navigli district that had hyacinths and a small garden and a kitchen large enough for a table where 2 people could sit until 2 in the morning without feeling crowded. The harbor in near darkness, the yellow light on the black water, the one lamp on the dock that the artist had put there, because Romano had said he had stopped deciding and finally knew what he wanted to say. I was finishing my doctoral thesis. My supervisor said it was the most original work this department had produced in a decade, which I stored in the place. I kept things that were true and that I wanted to remember. Ginevra had promoted me to co-director of Stanza. We had opened a second space in the Tortona district where Luca Ferrero had his first major show and sold every piece in 3 days. Livia and Sandro had been living together since October. They had spent the last 6 months arguing with enormous enjoyment about the renovation of a building they were buying together in the Isola neighborhood. My father sat at our kitchen table on Sunday mornings with the look of a man who had learned that some losses lead eventually to something that couldn't have been built any other way. Romano came home one Tuesday evening in March with the quality of contained energy that meant something had required his full attention and had been resolved. He set his jacket on the chair inside the door. He stopped when he saw me at the kitchen table, with paper spread around me and tea going cold, and a pen behind my ear that I had been looking for 20 minutes. He looked at me the way he had looked at me across a round table in a hotel near the Duomo 2.5 years ago, with the gray eyes that were not sealed at all. "You're working," he said. "I'm thinking mostly." He came to the table, moved a stack of papers, and sat down across from me with the unhurried ease of a man who had finally completely stopped finding this room something he needed to be careful in. "The thesis," he said, "the conclusion. I know what I want to say, but I can't find the right first sentence." Romano looked at me. The silver at his temples fully arrived now. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the diagonal scar through his left eyebrow, thin and old and so familiar, I no longer noticed it unless I was looking for it. "Start with the chandelier," he said. I looked at him. "The Marchetti dining room," he said. "You were looking at the chandelier when I first saw you. You were figuring out what it was made of, whether it was genuine." He paused. "Whatever the thesis is about, it starts from that. From looking at something until you understand the structure of it." I looked at him for a long moment. My impossible careful, no longer careful man who had known from 45 seconds in a hotel lobby that I saw things the way they were, who had accepted his ruin and called it a good decision. "Thank you," I said. "It's a good thesis," he said. "I would know. You've read all of it. You've written all of it." I started the conclusion that night, with Romano making tea in the kitchen behind me, and the Cotone painting holding the harbor in its better light across the room. The city outside the window was doing what the city of Milan does in late March, beginning quietly and without announcement, to become something completely different from what it was. The first sentence wrote itself.